Hard Times by Charles Dickens. In this PowerPoint presentation, we shall discuss the background or context of the novel Hard Times. As far as the background of this novel is concerned, there are several factors which led to the creation of this novel. Most importantly, the first factor that we have to take into account is Industrial Revolution. Because in this novel Hard Times, Dickens sharply criticizes the poor living conditions of the working class in industrial towns. And that is why we find that he depicts life in a fictional industrial town called Coketown, which serves as a symbol for the typical industrial town which existed in northern England of that time. We all know that the Industrial Revolution took place in Britain during 1760, like between 1680, and it continued till 1830. So what happened after the Industrial Revolution? Several industries, factories, came into being, and which led to rapid increase in the production of goods, and which expanded trade as well as increased demand. And with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, several changes took place in the early decades of the 19th century, which created a shift toward economies based on manufacturing and urban living that redefined society first in England as well as the United States and the rest of Europe throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, which means that after the Industrial Revolution, several things underwent change in the society. It redefined society because earlier there used to be no industries, and now when industries came into being, it cast a huge impact on the lifestyle of mankind as well. So it affected economy, which was naturally based on manufacturing and urban living as well, because with the coming of industries, what happened? The urban living also underwent change. So first it redefined society in England, that is society in England underwent a drastic change as because of this Industrial Revolution, and then in the United States, the rest of Europe, and gradually we find throughout the 19th as well as into the 20th century, this shift continues as a result of the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Small towns grew as large numbers of people moved there to find work, which is quite natural. When industries came into being, people began to dream of a comfortable life. They dreamt of earning more and more money. So what happened? They gradually shifted from the rural areas to urban areas. So small towns grew and large number of people simply migrated to urban areas for work. So London became famous for its thick fog in the 19th century, and this thick fog is nothing but the smoke that is emitted by industries, which mixes with natural moisture in the air. And because at that point of time, like industries, or let's say the advancement that was brought about by industries was taken into much concern, or let's say was the center of attention. So not much attention was paid to environmental issues, because the smoke that was emitted by these industries contributed in heightening the pollution level. But still, not much attention was paid to environment. As far as this novel Hard Times is concerned, we find that it addresses social and political changes associated with industrialization through the portrayal of Cooktown, which is a fictional town depicted in the novel by Dickens. Now, if you look at the name, you can see that it is named in reference to coke. And what is coke? Coke is that remaining part, the residue that is left after coal is burnt. So through the depiction of this fictional Coke town, in Hard Times, Dickens criticizes, as I said, this effects. He criticizes the several effects of industrialization, and he also addresses or deals with several social and political changes that were brought about by industrialization. Now, if we look at the conditions of this fictional or imaginative industrial city in northern England, it the these conditions are not at all suitable for healthy living. And these conditions, the conditions that existed in Coke Town, simply reflect those that were found in the emerging factory towns such as Manchester, Sheffield, and Liverpool. So these are the places where there were industries, and the conditions that we come across or that are depicted in the novel Hard Times by Dickens, those are the ones that were found in these places which had several industries. Even the housing was of substandard quality, and the proliferation of smokestacks are presented in detailed descriptions of Hard Times by Dickens. There was rapid increase because with the rapid growth of industries, what happened? It led to increase in pollution, much increase in pollution, and therefore smokestack, and therefore it resulted in smokestacks. And these are all clearly portrayed in the novel by Dickens. So what we can see that Coketown is basically represented as a place which is full of exploitation, where people are desperate, especially the industrialists, the factory owners, who are desperate to exploit the factory workers to their own advantage, and where we also find a picture of oppression, where factory workers are seen oppressed by the factory owners, a place where the interests of the factory owners or the benefits of the factory owners are not at all taken into consideration. The workers are found to have they're paid low wages, and they're made to work for long hours. So the picture that is represented in the novel by Dickens is that of exploitation, oppression, and desperation. So while I already talked about the factory conditions associated with the several industries where innumerable factory workers worked for long hours. So now let us talk about factory conditions, which is also a part of the background or context of the novel. So we find that in Hard Times, Dickens has made use of his own personal experiences, and he combines them with political understanding to criticize the conditions that were prevalent in the 19th century factories throughout England and Europe. So as I said that the workers, they were paid low wages, and they had to work for long hours. Like their work began before sunrise, and since the production was of huge importance, so they had to work for long hours, and there was hardly any regard for their rights, and as well as their suffering. Not only that, like we find that since Dickens himself had first-hand knowledge about the working conditions in the factories of industrial England, because when he was a child, he had worked in Warren's bootblacking factory in London, although it should be remembered that Dickens's experience as a child laborer in this factory was not that worse. So we can see that from Dickens' personal experience, we come to know that child labor was common in factories. There were many children who had to work to earn their livelihood because they were part of those poor, impoverished families who needed, sources of income in that changed society. And so they used to send their children to work as labor in factories. So we can see that there were children who, despite having family of their despite having their own family, had to work in factories for income, for their income. And there were also children, who worked because they were orphans and they had no families at all to take care of them. So these are the kinds of these actually were the factory. These were the fact conditions that prevailed in the 19th century factories. Now, the next issue that we are going to talk about as a part of the background of the novel is living conditions. So naturally, the living conditions outside the factories was no better than the conditions within the factories. As far as the conditions within the factories are concerned, we saw that they were paid low wages and they had to work for long hours. Not only that, there was like the factory owners did not have rather, any concern for their suffering of the workers, for their benefits. Okay. Now, if we talk about if we talk about the living conditions outside the factories, there too, these people suffered a lot. Since there was a population shift from rural to urban areas, so huge number of people flocked to the urban areas. And as a result of that, what happened? The urban areas got overcrowded, and so they had, cramped living spaces. There was lack of proper sanitation, so it was a completely unhygienic environment where these people lived, these factory workers lived. So as I said, as you can see, that there was lack of proper sanitation, especially in manufacturing centers in northern England. And here in this novel, Dickens has deliberately, you know, located this fictional cook town of Hardtimes in northern England in order to relate to the situation, to the conditions that. So we can say that even Cooktown had, lacked proper sanitation, which was a major manufacturing center. And since the environment, the atmosphere was completely foul and it led to the outbreak of diseases. So these places, especially, these manufacturing centers, since they were far away from the regulatory eye of the government in London, where hardly, people representing the government visited. These are the places which were hardly visited by the people belonging to the government. So the factory owners took advantage of the very situation and did not take into concern at all the living conditions of these factory workers. So in Hard Times, we find that Dickens provides us with such the descriptions of unhygienic living conditions where the factory workers lived, and at the same time, he portrays characters who fight for improving conditions for himself as well as his peers or fellow workers. So besides portraying the worse living conditions which prevailed in the manufacturing centers in northern England, in factories and outside the factories as well, Dickens also comes up with characters who fight for their rights and who are also a part of this working class. The next issue we are going to talk about is or theme is utilitarianism. Now, It is a popular philosophical school of thought which was developed by political economist John Stuart Mill and social reformer Jeremy Bentham. So what does the term utilitarianism mean? We know that we know that it was developed, this philosophy was developed by J.S. Mill and Jeremy Bentham, but now we need to know what this term actually means. Utilitarianism rested on the idea that self-interest drives all human behavior. It is very true that whatever we do, that is, whatever we do, whatever actions we perform in our daily life, we can say that it is out of our self-interest that makes us perform that action. And so utilitarianism believes in this idea that human behavior is driven by self-interest. The way a human being behaves, it is out of his or her self-interest. And all these actions that are performed by human must be evaluated by their potential that to create pleasure rather than pain to the individual, which means that whatever action is performed by an individual, we can only judge the quality of that action by its potential or capacity to give pleasure to others or pain to the individual. So we need to judge it whether that particular action is giving pleasure or pain to the individual. So this is how we can evaluate or judge actions that are performed by human. And we need to understand facts instead of the instead of understanding the emotional side or the emotional aspect. It is necessary. So according to utilitarianism, we should always, so if you look at the term, it is utilitarianism, as if utility. So we need to evaluate an action by its utility, whether it is able to give pleasure or pain. And while doing that, we need to understand only facts. We need to only understand things by logic, and we should not go by emotions, and we should not even consider the imagined results of those actions. So if we are given a situation, in order to judge or evaluate that given situation, we have to focus on facts and not the emotional implications or the imagined result of that given situation. And therefore, the evaluation, such evaluation of a given situation is possible only when we take into account the facts, logic, and not emotions. So in other words, it can be said that goodness also can be evaluated according to the consequences of actions and how much good or evil those consequences might bring to how many people. In this way, we can quantify human behavior, which means that whether a person is good or bad, or let's say whether an action is good or bad, that we can judge only, after seeing the result. If that action leads to a good result, then we can evaluate it as good. And if that action leads to something bad, then we can evaluate it as bad. So it depends. The evaluation of a situation, or let's say the evaluation of an action, depends on the kind of consequences that it might lead to. And it is this utilitarian attitude, that makes Dickens criticize or satirize characters like Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Joshua Bounderby, who completely rely on facts and reasons and never take into consideration, even by mistake, fancy or imagination, in order to assess a particular action or situation or while making decisions. So, as far as Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby are concerned, they completely go by facts and reasons and do not take into account imagination or fancy. So their attitude towards life is completely utilitarian, and it is this very attitude or this model, that makes Dickens satirize characters like Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby. So we can say that utilitarianism is actually a philosophy, that leaves nothing to imagination, which doesn't give any place to imagination. Everything is explained in terms of logic and facts, in terms of which means in terms of reason. So, according to utilitarianism, the goal of every individual should be, to receive most pleasure out of life. And this is this utilitarian attitude, that if we say that an individual has a utilitarian attitude to life, which means that individual's objective or aim in life is only the only objective in life is to receive the maximum pleasure possible out of life. So utilitarianism is concerned with utility, well-being and pleasure in life. But from the very beginning of the novel, we find Dickens introduces us to this utilitarian way of thinking, because, as I said, Mr. Gradgrind and Bounderby, they are the most outstanding representatives of the utilitarian philosophy. As far as Mr. Gradgrind is concerned, he, like the children who study in his school, they are taught only facts from their early age. And Gradgrind feels, that only facts are important in life. For him, love, emotion, feelings do not matter at all. And as far as Bounderby is concerned, we find that he keeps a farm, like he's a factory owner, he keeps a firm belief in this utilitarian system. So whether it is in the beginning and in the end, we find that he is in the same situation. And Bounderby, even, he does not go through any personal development. He represents the ideology of facts, only facts. And he's someone who lives in an illusion of a self-made man. He always projects himself before others as a self-made man. And as a factory owner, he is not at all concerned about the well-being of his workers. The next theme that we are going to talk about is divorce in the 19th century England. Because we will come across a character in the novel who is stuck in a marriage, who wants to get out of his marital life, who wants to put an end to his wedlock, but is unable to do so. So now let us discuss this theme, divorce, in the 19th century England. Divorce was possible in England. This is all information, like divorce was possible in England only by an act of parliament before 1857, so before late 19th century. So divorce was possible only by an act of parliament. And so parliament has to pass an act, and then only divorce could be made possible. So what was needed was that one has to bring the case before the parliament, but this involved huge expenses, and therefore only the wealthy people were able to afford divorce, because it involved, as I said, huge expenses. So now if we take into account the condition of a worker who wants divorce, so naturally it was not It was beyond his, power. He couldn't afford a divorce since it involved huge expenditure. As far as men are concerned, during that time period, they could get a divorce only on the grounds of adultery. Like if his wife is found to have an illicit or illegal relationship with another man, then on that ground, a man could get a divorce. So only on this ground. As far as wives were concerned, they could also seek a divorce. They could also get a divorce if they could prove that their husband was involved in adultery, was in a relationship, illicit relationship with another woman, and along with that, if she could prove that her husband was being cruel, had been cruel to her, then she could get a divorce. But if a woman left her husband, suppose all of a sudden a woman leaves her husband, then law could make her return to him. So under that circumstance, a woman was forced or compelled by law to return to him. So law had that power to, make her return to her husband. In 1857, this is another information. So let's read. In 1857, Parliament passed the Matrimonial Causes Act. So it was in 1857, this matrimonial causes, like causes or problems related to marriage, were related to this act, which moved divorce hearings from Parliament to a special court, which may have marginally reduced the cost of divorce. So we saw that divorce involved huge expenses and it was beyond the affordability of a common man, or let's say of someone. It was one middle class man, or maybe someone who was not very rich. It was not possible for that person to afford divorce. So when this act was passed by Parliament in 1857, so the case was moved from that the case would be heard in a special court, which marginally, like though it reduced the cost of divorce, but very marginally it got, the reduction was very marginal. But apart from that, little is changed. As far as the other conditions are concerned, nothing changed, only the hearings. It was decided that the divorce hearings would take place in a special court. And adultery seemed to remain the only ground for seeking divorce. And women, like wives, they did not even need to prove life-threatening cruelty as additional grounds. If they could prove that their husband was involved in an adulterous relationship, then they could easily get a divorce. So this meant that many people living in permanent conditions of unhappiness and estrangement had no recourse. So this implies that people who could not afford divorce, number one. Secondly, people who could not prove adultery, they had to remain in that quagmire. They couldn't get out of that unfortunate, or let's say that unhappy wedlock, and remain permanently in that state of unhappiness. So after having seen, or after having discussed issues like industrial revolution, its after effects, the living conditions, the conditions which prevailed in factories during the 19th century, then the social issue, divorce. After having discussed all these issues, we can say, or we can conclude that while writing this novel, Hard Times, Dickens took into consideration all these matters, social, political, let's say socio-economic issues, social, political, and economic issues, let's say these problems, and therefore the way he depicts the characters and their actions in the novel, everything makes the novel a kind of social protest, for it deals with several significant social problems of the time. And that is why the approach that he has in the novel is satirical. And it is with the help of satire that he criticizes these serious social, political, and economic problems during those years after industrialization that had taken a firm hold in society. So these are the problems which prevailed in the society after industrialization, and Dickens deals or focuses on these issues and criticizes them severely in this novel, Hard Times. So we can see that how all these social issues became a part of the background of the novel Hard Times, and how brilliantly Dickens deals with all these issues in his novel